All right, vous lever. Please be seated. Pouvez-vous s'asseoir.
Mr. Ngai, it has been brought to our attention that you would prefer to finish after this session that now commences and continue tomorrow. Is this correct? Pardon.
The accused, please forgive me, Your Honour. Seeing how things are going, I'll see whether I can finish in the second session, round off on the point that I had embarked upon. But if I do require extra time, I will let you know, Your Honour.
We are fine with that, Mr. Gassona. Please let us know. You have still the floor. I see.
The accused, thank you. Honourable members of the bench, alongside the road at Boy Rabe, I was welcomed by the local population with shouts of joy. Women were throwing down their wraps, which meant that the vehicle had to slow down right next to the Ngubutu's Brothers Evangelical Church, the compound adjacent to that of my father's. At that particular place, I saw a densely packed crowd in front of my father's gate. I got out of the vehicle and I started greeting some people, and then I went inside the compound to embrace my father. He took me into the lounge for prayers. Once the prayers were over, I went out and I saw in front of the gate a number of young people alongside some adults, some wearing gree-grees on them. The people told me that these were anti-Balaka, or so-called anti-Balaka resistance people. I went up to them, I greeted them, I introduced myself to them. Some told me, "President, we know you. Just you don't need to introduce yourself to us." They knew me due to the role that I held in the football world. I thanked them and went off again to stay with my father, and my father's brothers with their wives who had come to visit me, including my cousins and people from the church. At that particular time, honourable members of the bench, Wenezui was also there. Before leaving, he said, and let me quote, "Grantu, tomorrow morning I'll come with the Sangaris to take you to sort out what's expected with the general of the French mission." Following morning at 10 a.m., I heard the sound of engines approaching the compound. When they arrived, they asked me to get into their armoured vehicle, but I preferred to travel with the MSK political party, Mr. Willie Boner. Once we had arrived at the airport, the French military vehicles stayed not too far from a base where I encountered many members of the so-called anti-Balaka resistance. That's where I came across Captain Charles Gremangu for the very first time, and several anti-Balaka resistance people. When Zhu came up to me to tell me that a lieutenant of the French army who was nearby was the general's envoy, and that the general gestured that I could go up to him. Honourable members of the bench, I went up to him. We greeted each other, and he said, "Are you Mr. Ngai?" And I answered, "Yes, that's me." And he asked me to hand him my dossier that the general was waiting for. And I asked him, what dossier? And he answered, the candidature dossier to run in the transitional presidential election. And I said, I wasn't told about that. And you're also saying that the deadline for handing in these candidacies is getting very close. So how can I go about this in so short a space of time to complete a dossier with all the necessary paperwork? I simply can't do that. I don't have my birth certificate. I don't have my certificate of nationality. All my documents were spoiled and defaced by the Salaka. My house was ransacked. So I really don't know how to go about things. And even if you were to file my candidature, Mr. Lieutenant, who would vote for me over there? The assembly is mainly made up of Njatodia's appointees, which means that they will trust a candidate from the Salaka camp. And so it will prove very, very difficult for me. Your Honours, he said to me, if it's us who submit your entry, your dossier, we'll find a way to get you through, end of quote. The problem was that I didn't have my civil status records on me. The only document I had on me was my passport. And he said that he would put this problem to his superior, the general, and that he would come back to me through Sebastian Wenezui. He didn't understand that Wenezui hadn't explained things to me when I was still at Douala. And the lieutenant and I then went our separate ways, and I returned among the so-called anti-Balaka resistant people. It was at that juncture that the anti-Balaka resistance people suggested to me that I help them, but I didn't answer immediately. I asked to go back home, and I was escorted by the Sangaris. Wenezui went with me. He asked me to be the mouthpiece of the so-called anti-Balaka resistance people. I wasn't sure. I asked them to give me a bit of time. Then the anti-Balaka resistance people from Boy Rabe went up to me and asked the same thing. They insisted so that I would help them, because they had nobody to bring their demands before the new national and international authorities. And I told them, okay, but on one condition, and only if you accept to abide by the orders of the government and the international forces, to not loot, steal, or attack anybody, including the Muslims, and to not wreak havoc, irrespective whether people get what they want or not. And I ask you to get everyone to toe the line and pull together unconditionally. And my conditions, I said, are non-negotiable. It was only after that I called Wenezui to tell him what I thought, and that I agreed to help them. After that, I warned him about their elements getting out of control. I didn't know any of their elements. So they'd have to be made to act responsibly. The next day, I asked those who had come to see me to attend a meeting at my father's house. And I also asked Wenuzui to bring some resistance senior officials, anti-Balaka resistance senior officials, so that we could speak face to face, and so that the others could hear from my mouth the rules that had to be abided by before I could commit to help them. On the 16th of January 2014, the Camerooni general, who was the head of the chief of staff of the Miska force, General Tumenta, he called Wenuzui and told him that he wanted to see the political representative and some senior members of the resistance. And the next day, in his offices, he wanted to see them for a talk. Wenuzui called me up to tell me, and that he would see things with Captain Ungramangu so that he could give me the names of the anti-Balaka resistance leaders, and that I could see things with Lieutenant Konote, who was in the 4th district, to see whether he could appoint other anti-Balaka resistance chiefs from Boirabe to go with me. So the next day we went with about 8 or 10 people. I can't quite remember how many exactly. But once we arrived, they took away all our telephones. The general said, except the minister's telephone, he said. And the general told us that he had information according to which some individuals were organizing a boycott of the presidential elections, the man or woman president who would be responsible for bringing back peace in the country, and that he was doing his utmost to make sure that that election went smoothly and properly, and that nobody was to get in the way by causing any trouble. And that's why the chief contacted all the individual groups to talk with them. So I spoke and I said, General, I don't understand what you're saying. You're saying that today people are daring to try to stop this election, while everybody is expecting with bated breath to have a president who will very swiftly bring back peace. And the so-called anti-Balaka resistance people are not against the elections. On the contrary, they want, during these elections, that a woman candidate is chosen, because the men have proved their limits, their limitations. And what I understand from 2 or 3 official statements, that they want that the candidate that emerges as the winner of this election thinks of them, so that people from the provinces can go off again. At the very same moment, Your Honours, at the time when the last person to speak, the general received a telephone call and he stepped out to take the call. Upon his return, he announced to us that we were all under arrest, without telling us the reason why. Shortly after, the general called me up, called me into his office, corrects the interpreter, and he said, Mr. Minister, I just received an official call which tells me that, well, telling me that I have to keep you under guard, because according to some information, the anti-Balaka resistance may try to boycott the elections for transition president. And and I passed on what you told me, he said, but they didn't seem to understand. But I'll continue talking and I'll come back to you on this, because this is just not right. I invited you here. Me personally, I don't know who he had spoken to and who had made that official call. We stayed all night at Camp Mpoko, Your Honours. And then the following morning, the General called me up to say that ultimately the people he had spoken to, the person who had made the official call, had heard reason, and that I was going to be freed and that he would have me accompanied by the Miska force to take me home. And I accepted, and around 9 in the morning we left Camp Mpoko to set off on our journey. Upon our return, a cortege was made up with the Miska force all the way through to my father's house. On our arrival, there was a crowd of people with people of the anti-Balaka resistance people in that crowd who wanted to take on the international forces. I didn't realize until I had received a call from the general who told me, Mr. Minister, you need to speak to the crowd because they intend to attack those who escorted you. Immediately, I went out of the compound to speak to the crowd and ask, what's going on? Why do you want to have a go at the very forces that are here to help us? Move aside, let them come through. So they went with us. Interpreter correction. They are here with us. They need to be thanked and not threatened. They've done nothing. End of quote. Upon my return, I reported to some senior officials among the anti-Balaka resistance people present of what had been said with the general, and to explain the misunderstandings that had occurred as to why we were maintained at Mpoko camp. And at the end, anti-Balaka resistance people decided unanimously to support the candidature of a woman, Mrs. Catherine Samba-Panza, because all the men had failed. And this came about while she was campaigning on the radio. And they told me that this was the only person who helped them. And they said that she called Akete Ambogoske Timbe Ngubatisian, translation being my obstinate children, give an approximate translation, Your Honours, says the accused. So for them, she was a mum who would make sure that they would be looked after and they could answer and meet their concerns if she won the elections. And that's why, when she was elected, I wrote to her to congratulate her on her fabulous election. Your Honours, members of the bench, once Mrs. Samba-Panza was elected, immediately I sent her, on behalf of the anti-Balaka resistance, a letter of congratulations in the radio stations, but also in the written press, hoping that she would take in hand the crisis and put an end to it. That was my hope, and it was also the hope of the anti-Balaka resistance people. And after her election, she made a gesture, a motherly gesture to the anti-Balaka resistance people when she sent Mrs. Bridget Andara, mayor of Bangi's 4th arrondissement, with a sum of money of 3 million CFA francs. Shortly after, we received an invitation from her to go and visit her at her home near the Garagba neighborhood in the 7th district of Bangui. And when we arrived at her house, I didn't think that there would be other groups there. But it was on arriving there that I realized that the resistance movement, called anti-Balaka, was deep water, that nobody could plumb the depths of and hope to control. It was like a tide, like a sea tide. And the president received us with 2 people standing either side of her. One, her political advisor, Minister Guyama. I didn't know the person from the other group, except Leopold Barra, who I had met for the very first time at Douala. And I'd asked for his vehicle to take some goods to Bangui. She welcomed us, and then she spoke to tell us why she had made the invitation, particularly that she knew why the anti-Balaka resistance people had entered into revolt, and that she would call for help, and she was calling upon us to help bring back peace to the country that was bereft of any administration. And as a mother, she would do her utmost to meet our concerns, and we should also help her to get to that successful end. Each group spoke to thank her for the invitation that she had extended and made willingly. I said to President Samba Panza, I believe in you, and the resistance people believe in you, and are ready to offer you support in your weighty role. And the president replied by thanking us for what we said, and said that she was banking on us and that she could also trust us. And so we stood up and said goodbye to her before leaving. And it was during that particular meeting that I met Leopold, the interpreter correction, that I learned that Leopold Barra had represented the anti-Balaka resistance people at N'Djamena in Chad with Kokete and the former minister Bonda. When taking her oath, the President Samba Panza made her first trip to Boy Rabe to visit the internal displaced persons of the Catholic Church of Monastir. The Boy Rabe population threw on the ground their wraps so that she would walk upon them. There was lots of hope welling up in the population, but also among the anti-Balaka, or so-called anti-Balaka resistance movement people.
Your Honours, distinguished members of the court, a few days after his oath, the President of the National Transitional Council called me through his protocol office to let me know that he wanted to see me. The following day, I received by the director of his office, Mr. Firmin Ngrebada. And shortly afterwards, I saw Leopold Barra and Joachim Kokate come in. The director of his office received them, and together we sat on a sofa opposite him. We then followed him into the president's office. He came out again, and the 3 of us found ourselves in the office of the president of the National Transitional Council, or CNT. He explained to us that he and President Samba Panza had decided to call upon us as representatives of the anti-Balaka resistance, and that representatives of the movement should be part of the government, and that she wanted to put in place. And so he had thought of the three of us. He asked us to send him our curricula vitae and said that he would hand them over to the new Prime Minister. The next day, each of us came to hand our CV in to the President of the National Transitional Council, Ferdinand Alexandre Ngende. Now, a few days after, the President of the National Transitional Council collected the dossiers, and 2 days later, I received a phone call from Prime Minister André Zapayeke, who asked me to come and see him at his home in the Sika district next to Marie-Jeanne Caron Secondary School. I spoke with him for half an hour, and at the end he informed me that he had sent my dossier to be vetted to establish whether I was of good moral standing, and that the final decision lay with the President of the Republic. I bid him farewell, took my leave, and went home. A few days later, the government was announced on national radio. But only one person was appointed to the government, and that was Léopold Barra. A few moments after the announcement, a crowd of enraged resistance members besieged me, asking why we were not represented in the government, in this new government, who was going to make demands on our behalf. Your Honours, they vented their anger on national radio and in the private press and even to the international community. However, I advised them not to fall into that trap. I told them that President Zamba-Panza knew what she was doing, and that Mr. Léopold Barra had represented the anti-Balaka in N'Djamena, and therefore it was normal for President Zamba-Panza to appoint Léopold Barra to represent them. They retorted that they did not know him. The next day, the decree appointing him to the Prime Minister's office was issued, and Joachim Kokate was appointed Advisory Minister to the Prime Minister's office. Now, this in turn raised tensions to new heights. I was obliged to call the President of the National Transitional Council to explain the situation to him. He said to me, "Yes, cousin, I saw your call, but I was busy with the President," telling her how unhappy I was with her government, and that on the other side, the Seleka side, there were more of them. And I made it clear to her what I thought. That's what the President of the National Transitional Council said. I told him that this was precisely what I was calling about too. I was calling because tensions were running very high and I didn't know what to do. He told me that the President would contact me to make good her mistakes, and that in the interim the young people needed to be calmed down. I went back to them to explain things, but in the meantime, Wenezue had come to tell us that Mrs. Zamba-Panza had called him and promised to rectify and reframe things. And it was following this that Mrs. Zamba-Panza told Wenezue that the anti-Balaka resistance in his area should make a proposal for appointments, and that she would study the proposal. And that's how a meeting came to be organized at my father's home. The meeting was attended by leaders of the resistance known as the Anti-Balaka. And further to that meeting, a proposal for appointments to leading positions was set out, and it was Wenezui who took the proposal to the president of the Transitional Council. Now, only 2 individuals were appointed further to the proposal, namely Charles Gremangou as director of the Minister of Defence's office, and Séraphin Personne Faikere as chargé de mission at the office of the President of the Republic. It was the leaders of the resistance, known as the Anti-Balaka, who had arrived at the set of proposed appointments in my presence, and it was unanimously agreed that the proposal should be sent to the President. Now, Your Honours, in early February 2014, after her investiture, the President invited us to come and see her at the palace. She received us in the cabinet room and reiterated her desire to continue her work to bring about peace and reconciliation amongst the people of the Central African Republic. She wanted to achieve these objectives before the elections, and she also wanted our help. I took the floor to thank her for her invitation, to thank her for her time and her proven commitment to leading the country towards peace and reconciliation. For me, it was a commitment that we were ready to support. She expressed her wish to see the country pacified very rapidly, and this for the good of the Central African people. She stated that she wanted our support in that difficult task that she was undertaking. I took the floor to make a proposal to her. Your Honours, I said to her, Excellency, in the light of everything you have just told us, I am very much in agreement with you. The issue for the anti-Balaka resistance is that most of those who I see have come from the provinces. So I would like to make a proposal that would enable those who have come from the hinterland to return. Madam President, I suggest that you receive the leaders of the anti-Balaka resistance who have come from the hinterland, in other words, the provinces and the villages, and that you explain to them that you have inherited a very difficult situation where there is no money, and that you wish to offer to provide them with large vehicles that will take them home while you negotiate with the partners of the Central African Republic, and that once you have secured funding, you will send them something to enable them to take up their farming activities anew. I think they will understand you and agree to go back home. That was my proposal. And I made it because I believed that the young people that I had seen were very amenable. And what's more, the months of March and April were approaching, and the rains were coming for their fields. The President thanked me for the proposal and said that she would call me again to see how things could be put into motion as soon as possible. So I was expecting the President to call me about the proposal that I had made for members of the anti-Balaka resistance to return to the provinces. But nothing came of it, and I don't know what happened. Honourable judges, distinguished members of the court, to my great surprise, and everyone else's, on the radio we heard an unexpected statement made in Mbaiki by the president and by General Soriano of the Sangaris, calling members of the anti-Balaka resistance enemies of peace. Now, that caused a great deal of frustration, not only within the anti-Balaka resistance, but also among the general population. Now, I was really taken aback because she had asked me to help her, and I had put a proposal to her. I had also gone back to explain the proposal to those who had asked me to speak on their behalf, and I had told them that I was awaiting her feedback. Immediately after that statement was made, RFI called me seeking my reaction. I replied by saying that the anti-Balaka resistance was not the Defence and Security Forces and therefore was not responsible for the security of the people. But rather, it was Mrs. Zamba-Panza who had been elected to restore peace, not the anti-Balaka resistance. I said that the Sangaris too had been remanded to bring peace, and that therefore the Sangaris forces could not shift their responsibilities to the anti-Balaka resistance either. And indeed, how did one distinguish the other armed forces from the anti-Balaka resistance? The journalist asked if what I was saying was that the general was incompetent. I replied, "Those are your words. They must rise to their responsibilities and bring peace instead of levelling accusations." President Catherine Samba-Panza was deceived by her advisors, who led her to believe that by proceeding in that fashion, the international community would allow her to extend her term of office, owing to the unrest in the country, as had happened in Madagascar. Now, I understood the game perfectly well. It was incumbent upon the government to take account of the anti-Balaka resistance's demands, as well as cantonment. If she had tried cantonment, it would have helped in establishing the real anti-Balaka resistance numbers. However, the circle around Samba-Panza was manipulating her to divert her away from her objective, which was to work for peace, security, and reconciliation in the Central African Republic. Now, after that statement to RFI, on the morning of the 10th of February at around 7 a.m., I received a call from an unknown number. It was, in fact, the commander in charge of the Cameroonian MISCA contingency. He said, "Today it's the turn of your sector to disarm and we're on our way to you." I said, "Okay, Commander, do your job." I was taking breakfast at the time. In fact, in reality, they had already surrounded my father's compound without me knowing it. It was my cousin who warned me and said, "We're leaving." And when we left through our small emergency gate, I saw a lot of police posted all around the compound. 100 meters from the compound, the commander called me again. "Excellency, can you authorize us to enter the compound?" "And are you there?" I replied, "Yes, sir." I called Junior Mokpen, who was still in the compound, and told him to open the gate for them. As soon as he had opened the gate, they rushed towards the sitting room. They immediately let off smoke bombs accompanied by gun blasts, and that lasted 10 minutes. I looked at my cousin and said, "You saved my life. Thank you, cousin." That day, they arrested everyone they found in front of them, even if that person was not a resistance fighter. That day, several people who had come to visit me that very morning were arrested. My father's house was uninhabitable for a fortnight. The air in the house was unbreathable owing to the tear gas. As the compound was fenced in, the whole family slept outside within the compound. I immediately called in the journalists to show them the impact of the damage done by the international force. And I also had a bailiff survey the damage and take note of the bullet holes in the armchairs and in the walls. Everyone who visited the site said that it was clearly a planned assassination attempt on me. And it was because of that event that those who had asked me to speak on behalf of them to the authorities in Central Africa and to the international authorities, they published a press release in the private and public press, as well as on the radio. Now, following this very serious incident, someone explained to me that my assassination had in fact been ordered by Jean-Jacques de Mafout. Jean-Jacques de Mafout had come in an unmarked black car with dark tinted windows to the courtyard of the Buganda Secondary School in the 4th arrondissement of Bangui. He had spoken to 3 soldiers in Sango. And the soldiers with whom he had spoke were not foreigners, but they simply wore Cameroonian armbands, although they were not Cameroonians. Your Honours, a few weeks later, my brother-in-law, the former minister, Jacob Gebeti, informed me that Jean-Jacques de Mafout had commissioned his nephew, a retired gendarme called Roger Kogbowadi, to kill me. He told them to bring him my head. After that, I had no desire either to help the anti-Balaka resistance nor the government, let alone the president. A few people like Jacob Mopem Bionoli, Ngai Alfred Legrand, and some leaders of the anti-Balaka came to see me and said, "Minister, please don't abandon the children. Otherwise, the situation will get out of control. Please pull yourself together, Excellency, and help these children." I devoted tremendous physical, mental, and intellectual strength to the presidential and legislative elections, Your Honours. In April, on the 15th, I received a call from Zamba-Panza's political advisor, the advisory minister Clément Anissa Guillama, who said he wanted to see me on behalf of President Catherine Zamba-Panza. The next day, between 1 and 2 in the afternoon, he came to find me at my father's house. I received him in the living room, where there were still bullet marks to be seen. He was amazed with what he saw. Then he explained that the president had instructed him to re-establish contact and dialogue with me in order that I might help them to establish peace with the anti-Balaka, given that she had lost the confidence of the population after the statement that she and General Soriano had made in Mbaiki. She wanted to meet me. I agreed on condition that some leaders of the resistance accompany me because they had a lot that they wanted to say to her. On the 17th of April, we went to the presidency for a meeting with the president. On that day, I remember that a number of people were present. There was the director of the president's private office, Mr. Mabigui. Jean-Jacques de Mafout was present. Mohamed Kamoun, special advisor to the president, was there, and General Antoine Gambi, Christian Yamale, Secretary General to the presidency, as well as Professor Clément Anissé Guillama, political advisor to the presidency. I don't remember the exact turnout on behalf of the anti-Balaka, but I do remember that the following people were also present: Maxime Mokum, Judicaël, Mangazui Olofai, Dieudonné Ndomate, Sylvestre Yagouzou. Now, during this meeting, each leader of the resistance, the anti-Balaka, explained at length their indignation at the behaviour of the international force, which was allowing certain Central Africans to wear MISCA uniforms in order to use violence against them. They also complained of the aggressive communication and statements made with respect to them and their positions. The president promised to do her utmost to address at least some of their concerns and to work together with them towards reconciliation. When she finished speaking, I took the floor to explain to her that the attack at my father's home had been organized and planned by Jean-Jacques de Mafout, and that I had solid information implicating him in the attempted assassination on me. Your Honours, Jean-Jacques de Mafout, who was in the room, looked very uncomfortable throughout the remainder of the discussions. The president was stunned by what I had to say, but she made no comment. At the end, she thanked us and adjourned the meeting. At the end of the meeting, the Chief of Staff, Mr. Mabingi, asked me to follow him. Once in his office, he told me that the president had left 4 million Central African francs to feed the anti-Balaka, and it was up to me to disperse the funds. But in fact, at the end of the day, it was Maxime Mokum who collected the funds. Just as I was signing the discharge or the receipt, de Mafout came into the office. He stated that MISCA was in front of the palace and that he was coming for ssona. The director of the private office was astonished and asked what all this was about. De Mafout replied that he had no idea. I then turned to the director of the private office and said, "Director, is the hunt for ssona not over yet? Why are you persecuting me? He replied, no, Minister. The President was very sincere with you, but he was most ill at ease with that which was happening. Meanwhile, General Tumenta and Prime Minister André Payeke were already together with the President.
Shortly afterwards, the President's protocol officer came to collect the director of the private office. He took me a few minutes later into the President's office. Upon entering, I saw across from me the President, and on my left, General Tumenta, next to Prime Minister André Payeke. I asked the General if he had an arrest warrant against me, and he answered me, well, of course not, but that he had received instructions to arrest me, but that the time was not ripe, and that Prime Minister had made a proposal to the President that he was going to put to me. And the President said afterwards, said at that point, if Mr. Ssona signs the document, then you can take him to make a statement before the public prosecutor before freeing him, before releasing him. The Prime Minister opened his notebook. He held a piece of paper to me and asked me to copy out by hand on a clean sheet of paper exactly what he had already prepared. It was a statement where I would commit to continue to work towards peace. I didn't want to take any risk. I wanted to avoid people getting out of hand. And so I did what they asked me to do. After that, the General took me off to the gendarmerie, where the prosecutor of the time, Mr. Ghislain Grezege, was waiting for me. And he took my statement in an office, and at the end, he had me read my statement, which I then signed. The prosecutor asked me to come to his office every Monday, which is what I did, until he himself told me that I no longer needed to come. And it was already 8 p.m. by that time, and it was very dark outside. And Tumenta drove me back in his car. And he asked me, and he told me, rather, corrects the interpreter, that he didn't understand what was going on in the country, but he was going to ring me up so that we could talk about that. The next day, I received a telephone call from Clement Guillaume, a minister advisor, who told me that it was Demofut who had asked the MISCA to come and arrest me. And when the General arrived, it was he who had said to the President, "You're making here a serious mistake in arresting Mr. Ssona. I'll arrest Ssona, but it's he who's helping us appease the situation. So why did you call him in here only to arrest him? The others will no longer trust you, Mrs. President," end of quote. And that's how the President came up with the idea of making this proposal of a document that I signed. And I explained to her that it was because what I had said, because of what I said during the meeting at the President's office against Demofut, that he did that. And Mr. Guillaume apologized to me. One evening, General Tumenta called me up to ask me to come to his house around 7 a.m. the following morning. And upon arriving, he told me exactly what the President's advisor told me. And he added that if the President wasn't careful and continued to listen and to be manipulated by Jean-Jacques Demerfoot, then he was going to put a back up against the wall. And he gave me a huge amount of advice. I spoke to him of Demerfoot's assignment that Demerfoot has sent to kill me, and he said he was aware of this, and he had asked a report from a commander of a Camerooni unit who was entrusted on that case for that day, and he even confirmed information according to which civilians had been disguised to wear a military badge, a MISCA military badge, and that the commander in question had been subjected to very rigorous disciplinary action. Honourable members of the bench, honourable presiding judge, on a regular basis we would speak, and he helped considerably. He helped me considerably in my endeavours, and he received my advice as well when I heard things or I actually saw things go awry with the MISCA. Immediately I would tell him of that, and after he would then offer advice. And there was a sort of an entente cordiale that I would work with that very worthy Camerooni general, whose the future of the car was very dear to his heart. But unfortunately, death ripped him away from Central Africans who loved him dearly, and he had a high sense of duty. Peace be on his soul. Your Honours, the transitional government understood the work that I had done to restore peace, and that my life was under threat by some quarters of the anti-Balakers who didn't want to continue on the road to peace, and that was also threatened by the Angelo family and by Angelo himself, who wanted to endanger my life. And this was one of the ways that the transitional government tried to protect me, by understanding the crucial role that I had in the return of peace to Central Africa. This is borne out by decisions made by Ande Kwayara, Minister of Defence, on 30th of October 2015, bearing the reference number 751, as well as the decision of the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Central African Army, Mr. General Victor Yacoub, with reference number 318, emanating from the National Defence Ministry. After all these events, I preferred working directly with the Salaka senior officials rather than the president. Well, at the same time, we had struck up with certain Salaka senior officials a working project to move towards peace together without expecting anything from the government, because what I saw in the government's conduct was that if we didn't stand up to the mark and shoulder responsibility to achieve reconciliation, then the government wouldn't do anything at all. And that's why I took it upon myself, alongside some anti-Balaka resistance officials, to go and see the current transport minister, Jono Abba Gotrond, at his home. And we came to an agreement that this was the right way forward, and that now we had to put together a project with a mandate, and also identify partners to finance what had to be done. After a number of meetings, we put together a program of actions that had to be undertaken, with a budget that was put at around 49 million FCFA. During our discussions, we said that we'd have to send our project, this budgeted project, to the Central African government, first of all, before and get their point of view before sending it on to the international community, because the work that we were doing, well, it was the government that should have taken it upon itself to do that. We handed on the project to the president, but we received absolutely no feedback from her, neither did we receive any feedback from the government. Shortly afterwards, we started receiving invitations from the Minister for Reconciliation, Mrs. Montaigne. There were several meetings. During these meetings, we were started to advise us to merge the resistance movement called anti-Balaka, because the government wanted one single interlocutor to help them work. The NGO Muda also did this approach with the NGO Parito to merge the anti-Balaka resistance movements in Bangui and the so-called anti-Balaka resistance in the south. In the month of June 2014, I received an initial visit from Vivian Boehner and Palion Zilabu in my office in the Football Federation to talk about the need for a meeting that the Muda NGO wanted to have with me. A few days later, I received a telephone call from a certain Anna Samba Panza, who introduced herself as the person responsible for the NGO Muda. She came to see me with Bena and Zilabo, and they explained the need to group together everything into one single coordination to make sure that demands would have weight and that we could weigh in the negotiations led with the government and the international community. Because if everybody were acting individually, then they wouldn't answer us. She explained to me that we had to move quickly because there was a program for dialogue with the Seleka outside of the Central African Republic, which I had no knowledge of. So I called upon the leaders of the Boy Rabe sector, so-called anti-Balaka resistance movement, to tell them about this need to go to this meeting and to get on with the people in the south. During the discussion, everybody accepted to go to undertake this meeting according to the proposals of these two NGOs, Muda and Parito, and the two NGOs set the date and the location on the United Nations Development premises, the former head office opposite the Ministry for Transports in Bangui. Now, these discussions lasted several hours, and there emerged a unified coordination, and news of which was carried by the media and relayed by the government, but also to the international community. The coordination was designed to further peace and reconciliation. After the setting up of this coordination, we were called to the President's office for a meeting with the political parties and civil society to announce to us that there would be a dialogue organized at Brazzaville in Congo. The President also asked the leaders of political parties and civil society to be part of that dialogue process. I had done a number of things with the representative of the President, Denis Sassou Nguesso, who was the mediator of the Central African crisis, Mr. Mokoko. Despite my best efforts, there was no outcome that actually emerged for the reasons I really don't know. And it was only actually when all political actors and the government felt that on our side we were working together with the Seleka to achieve a dialogue with the anti-Balaka, between the anti-Balaka resistance people and the Seleka. Because we were looking for money, they announced the holding of a dialogue at Brazzaville in Congo. Honourable members of the bench and distinguished members of the court, it was during the preparatory meetings for dialogue that the President ordered us to strike up contact with the resistance people in the provinces so that they would be part of the delegation, whilst placing a quota for each entity, capped therefore at 23 people that would be taken in charge by the government, their expenses. Upon leaving the meeting, I asked the leaders to identify and contact their counterparts in the anti-Balaka resistance movement in the hinterland so that they could come to Bangui and to enable the delegation to be ready for the trip. Beforehand, I made sure that I got in touch with some Muslims at PK5 in the 3rd arrondissement of Bangui, with whom I was in constant contact in order to work together in preparing the forum. I can give you a name, for example, an example. Mr. Abdul Waid, he is the head of the Muslims in Bangui. So we left Bangui in a government chartered plane, chartered by the Congolese government, and it did lots of to and fro's. And I went into the last chartered flight, which landed in the evening. The delegation of the anti-Balaka resistance entity were housed in a small hotel where everybody was housed throughout the entire duration of the forum. Distinguished members of the bench, distinguished members of the court, the Congolese President Denis Sassou Nguesso opened the forum with Catherine Samba Panza in attendance, with all the political delegations, as well as the civil society, including a delegation of a political platform. There was also the Cardinal of the Democratic Republic of Congo. After the opening, I was called upon to make a speech on behalf of the anti-Balaka resistance, which whetted lots of appetite in the room. The Seleka representative didn't speak during the opening speeches. Then President Catherine Samba Panza spoke, and at the end, President Sassou Nguesso adjourned the meeting. Now, in terms of the apportioning of the groups and breaking them up into workshops for each specific theme, the Seleka representatives refused to be part of the discussions to provide a contribution to ironing out or offering a solution to the crisis that was shaking the country for reasons that nobody could fathom who was there. President Sassou Nguesso entered into the fray, calling upon each group in his palace to try and provide a solution. The anti-Balaka resistance team was the second to be received, and it was on that occasion that I handed over the demands of the anti-Balaka resistance by hand. The president, the mediator president, took due note and promised that he would hand them on to Catherine Samba Panza, the president of the Central African Transitional Government, would hand them over by hand with his suggestions. And at the same time, he also communicated the Seleka's demands, who wanted the transition president to resign and to set up an alternative transitional government. In response, we said that it wasn't possible to go from one transitional government to the next. It's true that the president could improve upon certain points, admittedly, but it wouldn't be acceptable that she would be relieved of her presidential function. We wanted her to continue right the way through to the next elections to exit the country from its crisis, the crisis that was continuing to buffet it, and that she should make concessions for all stakeholders, including political parties and civil society, and that these latter should be involved in a balanced fashion in the peace process. And she thanked us for our position and gave us advice before we ultimately left the palace. After our meeting with him, he called once again upon the Salaka to offer their view of the anti-Balaka resistance people who didn't buy into this idea of another transition, and who wanted Catherine Samba-Panza to remain president of the transition government. At that particular point, the Salaka brought out a fresh statement saying that they would agree with continuing with the process. The mediator thanked them and urged them to act upon that immediately. As soon as they left the palace, they immediately made other statements saying that the Central African Republic should be partitioned. The mediator became absolutely furious upon hearing about that. And he called upon them and sent me into the plenary room and tried to get me sent people to get me from the plenary room to bring me to the palace of the Congo Republic. And when I arrived, the mediator was there alongside religious leaders, such as the current Cardinal Dieudonné Zapalainga, the Sultan of Ndele, Dafan, the leading representative of the Salaka delegation. He was also there. For the Salaka, there was the former minister Idris Saleo, personal advisor to Jotodi was there. Njono Abba was there. The current transport minister, the former minister of finances, Abdallah Kadri, was there, and other names that I forget. Your Honor, the President Sese took the floor to express how unhappy he was about the Salaka's approach, and he paid tribute to the anti-Balaka resistance delegation, who had said what they were going to do and stood by it, contrary to the Salakas. And he asked me to speak to my Central African brothers, honourable members of the bench. I took the floor to talk to the Salaka representatives, and I begged them to give a chance to the Central African people who were suffering the desperate consequences of this crisis, this long tunnel where there was no light. And it's up to us to give them a glimmer of hope and not to add extra suffering to what they've already gone through. If you have in your heart a light of love for our country and this people, and if you forget this idea of the partitioning of our country, you must remember that our country is one and indivisible. At the end of what I said, the mediator said, "You've just heard your brother speak." Immediately, Minister Dafan took the floor to say, "Mr. Mediator, Excellency, if what my brother, Minister Ngai is saying, and if he's saying it right from the bottom of his heart, I will signed the agreement without the slightest condition. The mediator president once again thanked us and asked us to retake our seats in the auditorium because he was going to follow us into the room to close the forum. But President Sassou Nguesso had very much reproached the Sultan, saying that a territory leader shouldn't say one thing and then its opposite, and that in the next breath, and that when a chief speaks, he should stand by what he says. You gave me your promise, you gave me your word as a leader, and you are, as soon as you're out of the door of my palace, you change tack. That's not acting responsibly. When I rose to leave, it was the Cardinal of the Democratic Republic of Congo that took me by the arm and to say to me, "My son, you'll go far. May God bless you." During all these negotiations, the President, Catherine Samba-Panza, hasn't been with us. Before the signing ceremony, the representative of the Seleka, Mr. Dafan, spoke to officially state the Seleka's commitment without conditions to further the negotiations of the Brazzaville Forum and in favor of said negotiations. Next day, while I was in the market, a representative of Mrs. Catherine Samba-Panza ran up to me to ask me to go immediately to the airport. I put my luggage together as quickly as possible and off I went with Florent Kemmer and Dieudonné Huranti. In the plane, she told us that she wanted to travel with us to show the Central African people that we were henceforth united, that we were one to achieve peace. Dafan, Jean-Jacques Demafoot and Sayo were also in the plane. Once we arrived in Bangui,
Ms. Dimitri, is there an issue with Mr. Yekatom?
There is, Mr. President. I'm told by the security officer that he needs a translation because the security officer doesn't speak French. So a member of the team went in the other room to discuss. I'm sorry for the interruption.
No, you don't have to be sorry for the interruption. It's very important that he understands everything. Since we have a break, Mr. Gassona, you provided us with an itinerary, so I see there is a lot what you want to tell us further. So you won't be able to finish today, I understand. So I also understand from what we have been made known is that you would prefer to stop midday, so to speak. That would be shortly in a couple of minutes. And we also understand that it must be exhausting to speak alone for a couple of hours. So is my impression correct? Would it be okay to say that we now stop the hearing for today and you finish tomorrow with your statement?
Ssona. I understand what you say, Your Honour. Perhaps I could use just the 10 minutes that remains, and possibly then tomorrow I can continue, with your leave.
If we are sure that Mr. Yekatom gets translation, then what is the problem, by the way, with regard to that?
I think it's a health issue, but the security officer doesn't understand what is being said by Mr. Yekatom because the security officer doesn't speak French.
Yeah,
which is why now someone went with the security officer to see what is the issue with Mr. Yekatom.
So, but if we have here a health issue, I think we would simply have to finish for today. You understand that, Mr. Gassona, if there is a health issue with Mr. Yekatom, I think it's best to stop here. And we hope that Mr. Yekatom will be better tomorrow. And if there is a problem with Mr. Yekatom tomorrow, we can do it perhaps that he follows from the detention center, if this would be possible. Yeah. So let's conclude the hearing for today under these circumstances, and we continue tomorrow at 9:30.
Rise, vous vous levez.